I was cheated on by my husband and our couple's therapist, so I quietly gathered evidence, exposed them both, and rebuilt a life they'll never touch again. They say eavesdropping never leads to anything good, but sometimes it leads to something necessary. I learned this when I walked into my couple's therapist's office and heard my husband of 8 years discussing our relationship problems with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, except they weren't talking about fixing our marriage. They were talking about hiding their affair. The woman we'd been paying to save our relationship had been systematically destroying it from the inside, and my husband had been helping her do it. What followed wasn't the explosive confrontation you might expect, but something far more calculated, methodical, and ultimately devastating for both of them. Looking back now, I can see that the foundation of my perfectly constructed life began cracking long before I discovered the betrayal that would ultimately bring it all down. But when you're 38 years old and have spent 8 years building what everyone considers the gold standard of modern relationships, you become remarkably skilled at spackling over the cracks and repainting the facade. Michael and I were what people in our circle called a power couple. I was a partner at one of the city's most prestigious architecture firms, designing buildings that would outlast both of us. Michael directed a nonprofit that provided housing assistance to LGBTQ+ youth, work that earned him regular features in local magazines and invitations to speak at conferences across the country. Together, we hosted dinner parties that people talked about for weeks, attended charity galas where our presence was specifically requested, and maintained the kind of relationship that made our married friends simultaneously envious and inspired. Our home was a testament to both our successes, a restored Victorian that I'd spent 2 years renovating, with Michael's impeccable eye for design turning my architectural vision into something that belonged in magazines. We had separate home offices that reflected our individual personalities, but flowed seamlessly into shared spaces where we entertained and lived our carefully curated life. For 8 years, this had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything I dreamed of when I came out in college and started imagining what my adult life might look like. We'd weathered the usual challenges that long-term couples face: career stresses, family drama, the occasional disagreement about money or priorities, but we'd always talked through everything, always found our way back to each other, always maintained the kind of communication that made other couples ask for our advice. Which is why, when we hit what Michael called our rough patch about 6 months ago, I was genuinely concerned for the first time in our relationship. It wasn't anything dramatic, no fighting, no accusations, no sudden changes in behavior. It was more like a slow fade, a gradual disconnection that left us feeling like roommates who happened to share a bed. We still functioned well as a team, still presented a united front to the world, but the easy intimacy that had always characterized our relationship seemed to have evaporated without either of us noticing exactly when or how. The decision to seek couples therapy felt mature and proactive rather than desperate. We researched therapists together, read reviews, asked for recommendations from friends who'd had positive experiences. Dr. Elena Rodriguez came highly recommended by 3 different couples in our social circle, all of whom credited her with helping them navigate major relationship challenges successfully. Our first session with Dr. Rodriguez felt promising. She was professional, insightful, and seemed to understand the unique pressures that successful couples face when trying to maintain both individual identities and a strong partnership. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of polished competence that inspired confidence. Her office was warm but professional, filled with books on relationship psychology and framed credentials that spoke to years of education and experience. Michael seemed particularly responsive to her approach. He opened up in ways that surprised me, talking about feeling disconnected from himself as well as from me, about the pressure of maintaining our public image while struggling with private doubts. I was grateful that he felt safe enough to be vulnerable, proud that we'd found someone who could help us navigate back to each other. The early sessions did seem to help. We left feeling more connected, more aware of the patterns that had been driving us apart without our conscious awareness. Dr. Rodriguez gave us homework, communication exercises, intimacy-building activities, ways to prioritize our relationship amidst our busy professional lives. For the first time in months, I felt optimistic about our future. But then something shifted, though it took me weeks to identify exactly what had changed. Michael became more attentive after our sessions, but in a way that felt slightly performative, like he was checking boxes rather than genuinely reconnecting. He'd mention insights from therapy that seemed rehearsed, bring up topics Dr. Rodriguez had suggested we discuss, but the conversations felt scripted rather than spontaneous. More concerning were the subtle changes in his routine. Michael had always been punctual to the point of obsessiveness, but he started arriving home later on therapy days, explaining that he'd stopped for coffee or needed to return calls in the car. He began taking what he called processing walks after our sessions, saying Dr. Rodriguez had suggested solo reflection time to help integrate the therapeutic insights. His phone behavior changed too. Michael had never been secretive about his devices. We'd always had an open phone policy, sharing passwords and casually using each other's devices when convenient. But suddenly he was taking his phone into the bathroom, charging it on his side of the bed rather than our shared charging station, and developing a habit of turning it face down during dinner. When I mentioned these observations, Michael had reasonable explanations for everything. The late arrivals were due to traffic or work calls he needed to handle privately. The walks were helping him process complex emotions. The phone behavior was about setting healthier boundaries with work communications. Every explanation made sense in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that made me uneasy in ways I couldn't articulate. Dr. Rodriguez also began suggesting individual sessions to complement our couple's work. She explained that sometimes people needed space to explore personal issues that might be affecting the relationship, and that individual therapy could enhance the progress we were making together. Michael embraced this suggestion enthusiastically, scheduling weekly individual appointments in addition to our couples sessions. The individual sessions seemed to energize Michael in ways our couples therapy hadn't. He'd return from these appointments with renewed enthusiasm for our relationship work, full of insights about his personal growth and how it was improving his capacity for partnership. He started using therapeutic language more frequently, talking about emotional availability and authentic vulnerability and creating safe spaces for intimacy. I should have been pleased by his engagement with the therapeutic process, but something about it felt off. The insights seemed too polished, the language too practiced, the transformation too convenient. Michael had always been genuine in his emotional expression, but now he seemed to be performing the role of someone doing deep therapeutic work rather than actually doing it. My unease crystallized during one of our couple sessions when Dr. Rodriguez made a comment about how individual work often revealed patterns that couples couldn't see when they were always together. She and Michael exchanged a look that lasted just a moment too long, a glance that carried an intimacy that had nothing to do with therapeutic alliance and everything to do with shared secrets. That night, I lay awake analyzing every interaction I'd witnessed between them, every comment that had seemed slightly off, every moment when their professional relationship had felt more personal than appropriate. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my own insecurity was making me read meaning into innocent exchanges. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and once it took root, it began growing with a persistence that I couldn't ignore. The revelation came not through dramatic detective work or elaborate schemes, but through simple bad timing and unfortunate coincidence. I'd been traveling for work, consulting on a major commercial project that required several days of meetings with contractors and city planning officials. My flight back was delayed, then canceled entirely due to weather, and I managed to catch an earlier flight the next morning that put me home a full day ahead of schedule. Michael was at work, but I knew he had an individual therapy session that afternoon. On impulse, I decided to surprise him at Dr. Rodriguez's office. We could grab coffee afterward, maybe take one of those walks he'd been finding so therapeutic. It seemed like a romantic gesture, the kind of spontaneous affection that our relationship had been missing. Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a converted historic building downtown, with a private entrance that allowed clients to come and go without encountering others in the waiting area. I'd been there enough times to know the layout, to recognize the sounds that carried through the slightly thin walls between offices. As I approached the door to her suite, I heard voices from within, Michael's voice and Dr. Rodriguez's voice, but not in the measured tones of therapeutic conversation. They were talking intimately, with the easy familiarity of people who'd moved far beyond professional boundaries. "When David gets back tomorrow, we'll need to be more careful," Michael was saying, and something in his tone made me freeze outside the door. "He's already starting to notice that I'm different after our sessions." "You are different after our sessions," Dr. Rodriguez replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "You're more relaxed, more yourself. That's what happens when you're not performing all the time." "I hate lying to him," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes I think about just telling him everything, ending this charade." "And destroying both our careers in the process?" Dr. Rodriguez's voice turned sharp. "You knew what this was when it started, Michael. We both did. David's a good man, but he's also rigid, traditional. He would never understand that sometimes people connect in ways that transcend conventional boundaries." "Professional boundaries exist for a reason, Elena," Michael said. But again, his protest sounded half-hearted. "Professional boundaries are designed for typical therapeutic relationships," she replied. "What we have is different. We both know that what started as therapy evolved into something deeper, more authentic than either of our marriages ever were." My world tilted on its axis. Dr. Rodriguez was married too. I'd seen her wedding ring, Heard her mention her husband in passing during early sessions. The scope of the betrayal was expanding in real time, and I stood frozen outside her office door, listening to my husband and our therapist discuss the destruction of 2 marriages with the casual tone of people planning a dinner menu. "I should leave him," Michael said, and my heart stopped entirely. "This pretending is killing me. Every time he looks at me with trust, every time he talks about our future together, I feel like a fraud." "Patience," Dr. Rodriguez murmured, and I could hear movement in the office, sounds that suggested physical contact. "We'll figure out the right time, the right way. But for now, we have to be smart about this. Too much is at stake for both of us." I managed to back away from the door and make it to my car before my legs gave out entirely. Sitting in the parking lot, I tried to process what I'd just heard, to make sense of the conversation that had shattered every assumption I'd held about my marriage, my therapist, and my understanding of my own life. The betrayal was comprehensive and devastating, but what struck me most was the calculated nature of it. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a spontaneous attraction that had gotten out of hand. This was a sustained deception involving professional ethics violations, emotional manipulation, and the deliberate destruction of trust that I'd placed in both of them. I drove home in a state of shock that felt almost clinical, my mind working with unusual clarity despite the emotional devastation. By the time I reached our house, I'd made several decisions that would shape everything that followed. I would not confront them immediately. I would not act from emotion or impulse. I would not give them the opportunity to gaslight me or minimize what I discovered. Instead, I would do what I did best. I would plan, investigate, and build a case so comprehensive that denial would be impossible and consequences would be inevitable. When Michael arrived home that evening, I was sitting at our kitchen table with a glass of wine and a stack of architectural plans, projecting the image of someone who'd had a productive day of work. He kissed my cheek, asked about my trip, and told me about his therapy session with the practiced ease of someone who'd been lying consistently for months. "Dr. Rodriguez thinks I'm making real progress," he said, settling across from me with his own wine. "She says I'm becoming more emotionally available, more present in our relationship." I smiled and nodded and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated my support for his therapeutic journey, all while mentally cataloging every detail of his deception. The performance required was exhausting, but I'd had 8 years of practice at reading Michael's moods and responses. If he could act, so could I. That night, lying next to my husband who was living a double life, I began planning the most complex project of my professional career. But instead of designing a building, I was designing the systematic destruction of 2 people who'd betrayed not just me, but the fundamental principles of trust and professional ethics that made civilized society possible. I started with research. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was licensed by the State Board of Psychology and bound by ethical guidelines that strictly prohibited sexual relationships with clients. The violation wasn't just morally wrong, it was illegal, carrying penalties that included license revocation, professional censure, and potential criminal charges depending on the specifics of the case. I spent my lunch breaks at the law library, researching precedents for therapist misconduct cases, understanding the burden of proof required for licensing board complaints, and learning about the typical timelines for investigations and sanctions. I consulted with a divorce attorney under the pretense of asking questions for a friend, gathering information about asset protection and custody considerations in cases involving professional misconduct. Meanwhile, I began the delicate process of gathering evidence. I couldn't legally record conversations without consent, but I could document patterns of behavior, photograph schedules and receipts, and track the inconsistencies in Michael's stories about his whereabouts. I purchased a small digital recorder that I carried in my briefcase, ready to capture any admissions or discussions that might occur in public spaces where recording was legal. The most challenging aspect was maintaining the facade of normalcy while conducting my investigation. I had to continue attending couples therapy sessions, sitting across from Dr. Rodriguez while she offered insights about improving communication and rebuilding intimacy, all while knowing that she was systematically destroying my marriage for her own sexual gratification. These sessions became exercises in self-control that tested every ounce of discipline I'd developed during my professional career. Dr. Rodriguez would make observations about the progress Michael was making in individual therapy, how his increased emotional availability was benefiting our relationship, and I would nod thoughtfully while mentally documenting her manipulation tactics. Michael, emboldened by what he perceived as my obliviousness, became increasingly careless. He started taking longer for his processing walks after therapy, often returning with explanations that didn't align with the routes he claimed to have taken. His individual sessions began running overtime consistently, with Dr. Rodriguez's office apparently unable to maintain basic scheduling boundaries. The The breakthrough came when I discovered that Dr. Rodriguez had been billing our insurance for extended individual sessions that lasted 90 minutes instead of the standard 50-minute hour. The financial records provided a paper trail of their extended appointments, documentation that would be crucial for both the licensing board complaint and any potential legal action. I also learned that Dr. Rodriguez had a history of boundary issues with previous employers. Nothing that had resulted in formal sanctions, but a pattern of job changes and vague references that suggested ongoing problems with professional conduct. She'd moved to our city only 3 years earlier, after leaving a group practice under circumstances that weren't entirely clear. 3 months into my investigation, I had assembled a comprehensive dossier that included financial records, schedule discrepancies, photographic evidence of Michael's deceptions about his whereabouts, and detailed documentation of Dr. Rodriguez's ethical violations. I'd consulted with attorneys, researched licensing board procedures, and prepared a formal complaint that would trigger an investigation into her professional conduct. But I wanted more than just professional consequences for Dr. Rodriguez. I wanted Michael to understand the full scope of what he'd destroyed, and I wanted him to face that understanding in a context where his manipulative skills would be useless. I planned the confrontation for a couples therapy session, a setting where both of them would be forced to maintain their professional facades while I systematically demolished their carefully constructed lies. I scheduled the appointment for a Thursday afternoon, then spent the preceding week preparing my presentation with the same meticulous attention to detail that I brought to architectural project proposals. On the appointed day, I arrived at Dr. Rodriguez's office carrying a leather portfolio that contained copies of all my evidence, formatted and organized for maximum impact. Michael was already there, chatting easily with Dr. Rodriguez about some insight from his latest individual session. They both looked relaxed, confident, completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. "Before we begin today's session," I said, settling into my usual chair and opening my portfolio, "I'd like to share some observations about the therapeutic process that I think might be helpful for our work together." Dr. Rodriguez smiled professionally. "Of course, David. Your perspective is always valuable to our process." I removed the first set of documents from my portfolio, financial records showing the billing discrepancies for Michael's individual sessions. "I've been reviewing our insurance statements, and I noticed some interesting patterns in the billing for individual therapy sessions. It appears that these sessions have been consistently running 90 minutes instead of the standard 50-minute hour." The color drained from Dr. Rodriguez's face, but she maintained her composure. "Sometimes individual work requires extended sessions to address complex issues. This is a common practice in therapeutic settings." "I'm sure it is," I agreed, removing the next set of documents. "I've also been tracking some inconsistencies between Michael's reported whereabouts and his actual locations during these extended sessions. For instance, last Tuesday he mentioned stopping for coffee after therapy, but the receipts I found suggest he was actually at the wine bar 3 blocks from your office, during what should have been his appointment time." Michael was staring at me with growing horror, beginning to understand that his careful deceptions had been systematically documented. Dr. Rodriguez was struggling to maintain her professional demeanor, but I could see panic beginning to override her training. "David," she said carefully, "these kinds of surveillance behaviors suggest trust issues that we should explore in our therapeutic work together." I smiled and removed the final set of documents from my portfolio. "Actually, Elena, and I hope you don't mind if I use your first name, since we seem to have moved beyond formal boundaries. I think the trust issues we need to explore are the ones created when a licensed therapist violates professional ethics by engaging in sexual relationships with her clients." The silence in the room was deafening. Michael looked like he was going to be sick. Dr. Rodriguez had gone completely pale, her professional mask finally slipping to reveal the fear underneath. "I have no idea what you're implying," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm not implying anything," I replied, removing an audio recording device from my portfolio. "I'm stating facts based on conversations I overheard in this very office. Conversations in which you and my husband discussed hiding your affair, planning your future together, and expressing concern about maintaining your professional reputations while systematically destroying my marriage." I pressed play on the recording device, and their voices filled the office, Michael's admission that he hated lying. To me, Dr. Rodriguez's dismissal of professional boundaries, their casual discussion of destroying 2 marriages for their own gratification. When the recording ended, the silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "David, I can explain—" "No," I interrupted, placing the recording device back in my portfolio. "You can't explain this, Michael. You can't explain how you decided that our 8-year marriage was worth less than whatever this is. You can't explain how you participated in the systematic violation of professional ethics. And you definitely can't explain how you've been sitting in this office for months, letting me pay for therapy designed to fix problems that you and Dr. Rodriguez were actively creating. I turned to Dr. Rodriguez, who was still sitting in stunned silence. As for you, Dr. Rodriguez, I'll be filing a complaint with the state licensing board this afternoon. I'll also be providing copies of this evidence to your professional liability insurance carrier and to the clinic administration. I assume you'll want to contact your attorney. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Michael? I've already spoken with a divorce attorney. You'll be hearing from them soon. I'd suggest you find somewhere else to stay tonight, since I'll be changing the locks on our house this evening. The professional consequences for Dr. Rodriguez were swift and comprehensive. The state licensing board launched an investigation within days of receiving my complaint, and the evidence I'd provided made their findings inevitable. Her license was suspended pending a full hearing, and the clinic terminated her employment immediately upon learning of the ethics violations. The local newspaper picked up the story when the licensing board's actions became public record, and the coverage expanded to include discussions about therapist accountability and the vulnerability of clients seeking mental health services. Dr. Rodriguez became a cautionary tale in professional psychology circles, her name synonymous with the violation of fundamental therapeutic boundaries. Her marriage didn't survive the scandal. Her husband filed for divorce within weeks of the story breaking, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking full custody of their 2 children. The professional network she'd spent years building evaporated overnight, with former colleagues and referral sources distancing themselves from someone who'd brought such disgrace to the profession. Michael's consequences were more personal but equally devastating. His nonprofit work, built on a foundation of trust and community respect, became untenable when the scandal reached his professional circles. Board members expressed concern about his judgment and character, donors questioned their support, and staff members struggled to maintain confidence in leadership that had demonstrated such fundamental dishonesty. He attempted to salvage his career by taking a leave of absence and seeking therapy with an ethical professional, but the damage to his reputation in our tightly connected community proved irreparable. Eventually, he relocated to another city, taking a significantly lower-level position with an organization that either didn't know about the scandal or was willing to overlook it. Our divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward, perhaps because Michael's guilt made him unwilling to fight for assets he felt he didn't deserve. I retained our house and the majority of our shared investments, while he accepted responsibility for the emotional and financial damage his actions had caused. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive of my position. Friends who'd watched our relationship with admiration expressed outrage at Michael's betrayal and Dr. Rodriguez's professional misconduct. The LGBTQ+ organizations where we'd been active issued statements about the importance of ethical behavior and accountability within the community. For months after the confrontation, I existed in a strange state of emotional numbness, punctuated by moments of intense rage and grief. The systematic nature of my response to the betrayal had provided a sense of control and purpose during the crisis. But once the legal and professional consequences were set in motion, I was left to process the personal devastation of losing both my marriage and my faith in therapeutic institutions. I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, taking on increasingly complex projects that demanded all my intellectual and creative resources. My professional reputation, far from being damaged by the scandal, was actually enhanced by colleagues' respect for how I'd handled the situation. I was seen as someone who'd maintained dignity and strategic thinking under extreme personal stress, qualities highly valued in architectural practice. The healing process was gradual and often frustrating. I worked with a new therapist, a recommendation from a colleague whose vetting process was considerably more thorough than mine had been, to process the trauma of the betrayal and rebuild my capacity for trust. This therapeutic relationship was markedly different from my experience with Dr. Rodriguez, characterized by clear boundaries, professional competence, and a focus on my individual growth rather than external relationships. Almost a year after the divorce was finalized, I met James at a professional conference where I was presenting on sustainable design practices. He was an environmental lawyer working on green building regulations, and our initial conversation about overlapping professional interests evolved into something more personal over dinner. James knew about the scandal. It had been covered extensively enough in professional circles that most people in our combined networks were aware of the basic facts. But he approached the topic with sensitivity and respect, neither prying for details nor making assumptions about my readiness for new relationships. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, with both of us conscious of the importance of building trust gradually. James had his own history of relationship challenges, including a long-term partnership that had ended amicably but left him cautious about commitment. We spent months as friends before acknowledging romantic feelings, and additional months building intimacy without rushing toward major commitments. What I appreciated most about James was his respect for boundaries, both professional and personal. He understood the importance of maintaining individual identities within a partnership, and he brought his own experience with ethical complexities to our discussions about trust and accountability in relationships. 2 years after our first meeting, James and I moved in together, but we maintained separate spaces within our shared home. We'd both learned from previous experiences that independence and partnership could coexist, that healthy relationships required individual strength as well as mutual support. Our professional lives complemented each other naturally, with frequent opportunities for collaboration on projects involving sustainable building practices and environmental law, but we also maintained distinct career paths and social circles, avoiding the kind of complete merger that had characterized my relationship with Michael. The contrast between my marriage to Michael and my partnership with James illuminated how much I'd grown from the experience of betrayal and recovery. I was more aware of red flags, more protective of my own interests, and more realistic about the complexities of long-term relationships. I'd learned to distinguish between healthy vulnerability and naive trust, between supportive partnership and codependent merger. Looking back now, I can acknowledge a paradoxical gratitude for the betrayal that destroyed my marriage and faith in therapeutic institutions. The experience forced me to develop strength and independence I hadn't known I possessed, to clarify values and boundaries I'd previously taken for granted, and to build a life based on authentic personal choice rather than external expectations. Dr. Rodriguez never recovered professionally from the scandal. She eventually left the state, and attempts to rebuild her career in other locations were hampered by the paper trail of ethical violations and license suspension. The mental health field, despite its problems with accountability, ultimately proved unwilling to tolerate someone who'd so flagrantly violated fundamental professional standards. Michael's life remained more difficult to track, but mutual friends occasionally provided updates that suggested ongoing struggles with the consequences of his choices. His career never regained the momentum it had lost, his relationships remained unstable, and his connection to the community that had once embraced him was permanently severed. I felt no satisfaction in their ongoing difficulties, but I also felt no obligation to minimize the consequences of their actions. They'd made choices that violated basic principles of honesty and professional ethics, and the natural results of those choices were not my responsibility to mitigate. The experience taught me that betrayal, while devastating, doesn't have to be permanently damaging if you respond with intelligence rather than emotion, strategic thinking rather than reactive behavior. The calculated nature of my response had protected me from the worst consequences of their actions, while ensuring that appropriate accountability was maintained. More importantly, it taught me that trust, once properly rebuilt, could be stronger than trust that had never been tested. My relationship with James was founded on a realistic understanding of human fallibility, combined with a commitment to honesty and accountability that my marriage to Michael had lacked. Today, I live in the house I renovated during my marriage to Michael, but every room has been updated to reflect my partnership with James. The spaces that once showcased the illusion of perfect couplehood now reflect the reality of two independent people who've chosen to build a life together based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility. My professional practice has expanded to include consultation on ethical standards in professional settings, drawing from my experience, with therapeutic misconduct to help organizations develop policies that protect vulnerable clients and maintain accountability among service providers. The licensing board complaint I filed led to changes in continuing education requirements for therapists in our state, with new mandates for training on boundary maintenance and ethics violation prevention. Dr. Rodriguez's case became a teaching example in professional psychology programs, illustrating the devastating consequences of ethical violations for both practitioners and clients. Sometimes former clients of Dr. Rodriguez contact me, seeking advice about their own experiences with her manipulation and boundary violations. I've learned that Michael and I weren't her only victims. She had a pattern of targeting male clients in committed relationships, using therapeutic techniques to create emotional dependency that she then exploited for personal gratification. These conversations have reinforced my belief that my systematic response to the betrayal served a larger purpose beyond personal vindication. By documenting and reporting her misconduct comprehensively, I helped protect other potential victims and contributed to professional accountability in a field where vulnerable people deserve better protection. The story of my marriage's destruction and my strategic response has become something of a legend in our professional and social circles, a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical boundaries, but also an example of how personal devastation can be transformed into positive change through intelligent action and refusal to accept victimization. I share this story not to encourage others to seek revenge, but to demonstrate that betrayal doesn't have to define you if you respond with the same strategic thinking and professional competence that you bring to other challenges in your life. The goal isn't destruction for its own sake, but accountability, protection of others, and the preservation of standards that make civilized society possible. Michael and Dr. Rodriguez thought they were manipulating a trusting husband who would never discover their deception or challenge their narrative. Instead, they encountered someone who understood that trust, once violated, creates obligations for both consequences and protection of others who might face similar exploitation. In the end, the therapy sessions did teach me something valuable about relationships, just not the lessons that Dr. Rodriguez intended to provide. I learned that true partnership requires not just love and compatibility, but also shared values regarding honesty, accountability, and respect for boundaries that protect both individuals and the larger community. The betrayal that destroyed my marriage ultimately led me to a partnership that embodies these values authentically. James and I will never need couples therapy, not because our relationship is perfect, but because we've built it on a foundation of genuine trust, clear communication, and mutual respect for the ethical boundaries that make love sustainable over time. Sometimes the best revenge is simply building a life so much better than what you lost that the people who betrayed you become irrelevant to your happiness. Michael and Dr. Rodriguez destroyed something precious, but they also cleared the way for something better, if you're willing to do the work of building it properly.